morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me clearly. Okay. Well, for getting out of bed earlier than others have, and for making it all the way here and sitting down for my presentation, I'm going to make it totally worth your time for the next 45 minutes. We're going to focus on how we become really good storytellers. So this topic is about mastering visual literacy. How do we communicate through our pictures? Because we're all trying to tell stories, not by using words, but by using our photographs. A little bit about me. I have a dual career. I work as a physician 3 days of the week, and the remaining time is spent in photography. As a radiologist, I analyze images, attempting to make a diagnosis and therefore direct cure. As a photographer, I aspire to generate images that serve as visual therapy. I'm supported by these brands. I'm a creator for B&H. I'm working on the landscape photography learning module for Lightroom Academy with Adobe. I'm a Sony, Gear, and Nissi ambassador, and work with these other brands as well, PhotoPills, Flickr, The Heat Company, and Pangea. So a quick shout out to them. All right, so let's delve into this presentation. When we stand before our subject, whatever it may be that you are interested in shooting, if I am standing in front of a landscape, such as this is Yosemite, I am invested in it with all of my senses, right? I can see 360 degrees around me. I can feel the sand beneath my feet on the banks of Merced River. I can hear the roaring waterfall, Upper Yosemite Falls, coming down. You can feel the wind in your hair. You can smell the wet earth. So when you stand there and invest all of your senses, you have a heightened emotional response to what you're witnessing. As nature photographers, or any other photographers, our task is now to take that emotional experience and condense it into a 2D flat plate, right? We reduce all of those 5 senses to just one, vision. And our task is to evoke the same kind of heightened emotional response in our viewer. Isn't that a daunting task? Pretty tough to achieve, wouldn't you think? But there is a way we can do that. Convey exactly what we felt, and maybe even more. Infuse it with our creative vision. Why do we want to do that? Why do we want to communicate with the viewer? I love this quote by Ansel Adams, which says, "A great photograph is one that fully expresses what one feels in the deepest sense about what is being photographed." We choose to capture something because we have established an emotional connection to the subject, right? So then it's important to convey what we feel. If we don't connect to our subject and have an emotional response, how can you expect the viewer to do that? First and foremost, we need to make that emotional connection. Okay, communicating through visuals is something we have done since prehistoric times. On the left, you have a cave painting from 50,000 years ago. Think about this. Somebody who lived 50,000 years ago probably spoke a language, maybe did not even have language back then, did not have any written word, decided to carve a picture onto the walls of the cave. And today, when we look at that image, 50,000 years later, in a different culture, in a different environment, we know that day there was some sort of a procession happening that involved animals. It involved people with bows and arrows. Perhaps there was some dancing going on, right? What a powerful mode of communication it is to have a visual. And we have this at our fingertips as photographers. And then, of course, when color came along, the emotional impact of images increased even more. We could speak even louder and more clearly. We are actually set up to receive visual stimuli. We are programmed all through evolution because it was necessary for our survival, right? We needed to escape predators. We needed to survive. So when you look at it and say, why is a picture worth 1,000 words? It's because 50% of our neural tissue is directly or indirectly related to vision. Can't say that about any of the other senses. So vision ends up being the primary sense. A human brain can process an entire image within 13 milliseconds. Think about that. How many words are you able to get across in 13 milliseconds? And how many can you actually comprehend? But to analyze an entire image and have a reaction to it, what a powerful mode of communication we have at our fingertips. It takes us only half a second to respond to a visual stimulus. If I showed you this picture, I don't have to tell you anything else. You already know what the story is, right? So that's what I'm trying to get at. We use images to communicate with our audience as well as to creatively express ourselves, okay? Since it's a mode of communication, we could say photography is a universal language. I could show a picture to someone living 10,000 miles away, and they would understand what I am trying to say. Can't say that about too many languages, can we? So if photography is a universal language, and we want to master it, we want to become fluent in it, then we have to do what we would do with any other language. We start with the basics. What is the fundamental thing we need to learn? Let's start with the alphabet. In photography, the analogy would be our camera and our gear. Learning how to use our camera settings, learning how to use our lenses, setting up a tripod, all of these basic things, the mechanical aspects of photography, we're just learning the alphabet. After we learn the alphabet, we move on to the syllables. Well, what are the syllables in photography? We have, again, the fundamentals of exposure triangle, focus, depth of field, concepts that we must understand in order to build upon our knowledge base. So the next time somebody asks you, what is the EXIF? Remember, it is somebody who's in kindergarten and is just learning the alphabet. So please be generous with your information. All right, what comes next? We have learned our alphabet, learned our syllables. Time to start making words. Okay, what are the words in an image? They're actually visual elements. Some people like to call them focal points. You know how sometimes you walk into a room and you're standing in awkward silence, unable to find the words to communicate? You don't quite know what to say. Everybody's a stranger over there. And you're thinking, how can I start a conversation? That's similar to standing at a scene before nature, finding everything in harsh light, and wondering, what am I going to photograph here? What is this story about? I'm not really emotionally connecting to anything in the field before me. Well, in the case of standing in an awkward room, you would perhaps do something as simple as, let me start talking about the weather, right? Just start the conversation. In the case of photography, though, there are specific elements we look for when trying to find our words or our focal points. All through evolution, because vision was so important for our survival, we have trained our eyes and our mind to be drawn to certain things. It was very important we learned to differentiate between the stripes of a tiger and the stripes that form with blades of grass, because you needed to survive, right? So your mind automatically knows what is important and what is not important. The human eye is drawn to brightness, color, contrast, texture, and whenever there is a human element, that tends to anchor the eye as well. Once we know this, we now know where to find our focal points. Make sense? Let me give you specific examples to illustrate that. If you look at this image, just close your eyes, open your eyes, look at the image, and consciously follow the path of your eye through the frame. I guarantee you, it's going to end up in the point of maximal contrast. You see that silhouetted tree? Lit up backlight? That's where the eye is going to land. Why is this important? In order to make an image emotionally compelling, we must control how the viewer travels through the frame and where the viewer's eye lands, right? Let's take a look at another example. So that was an example for brightness and contrast earlier, right? That's where the eye went. This is an example for color. When I first arrived at this scene, everything was in harsh light. I stood there and I was like, I don't know what this picture is about. I don't know what to shoot. Everything looks kind of harsh. And then the storm clouds rolled in and the angled light of the setting sun began to illuminate the mountain and the foliage beneath it. All of a sudden, I now know what the picture is about. Why? Because my eye is being drawn to color and luminance. Very simple, isn't it? Once we understand that and keep it in our mind, it makes it possible for us to create other images during the same time. So while I was shooting this, I saw this scene. And I knew again, color, contrast, luminance creates a compelling image. So it enhances our potential to make our captures. With me so far? All right, so we talked about brightness, we talked about color, contrast, and remember I had added texture as well as human element into it. This would have been a great picture even without the kayakers. But once you put the kayakers in there, you know your eye is automatically drawn to that. Why? Because it's a point of contrast, and a human element always attracts attention. It's no accident why Instagram carries a whole bunch of environmental portraits that become hugely popular. Because when a viewer looks at a human element in the scene, they automatically imagine what it would be like to be standing there. Once you make that sort of an emotional connection, the image becomes more compelling. Okay. All right, so we have identified our words. We have enhanced our vocabulary. You guys now know what the elements are that you would look for in order to make the captures. What is the next progression in a language? Absolutely, sentences. What are sentences? Sentences are nothing but the careful arrangement of words in order to convey meaning. Would you agree? Well, in a composition, what you're dealing with is careful arrangement of visual elements to produce an aesthetic image. You see, it's as simple as that. Just as you would arrange words in a sentence, you would carefully arrange your visual elements floating around in the 3D space to create an aesthetic image. Okay, let's delve into this a little bit deeper. Step by step, we're going to take a look at this. First thing I want to talk about, this is just a quick slide to say that the ability to create chaos is really what composition is about, especially true when you're shooting nature and there's a whole bunch of visual elements thrown at you, right? I like this. Let's move on. Okay, so the first and foremost thing we need to talk about in composition is balance. Balance to a composition is equivalent to the order of words in a sentence. If the order of words in a sentence is not set properly, that sentence will have no meaning. if you lack balance in your composition, it will be an equally meaningless image. What do I mean by balance? When you identify your focal points or your visual elements, it's important to distribute them with the correct weight distribution in the image. Let's take a look at a specific example here. I know you're looking at this image and going, aha, Sapna, I know what you did there. I see that the tree is an important focal point because it's a point of contrast. I see the light on the mountain, brightness. Eye is drawn to that. That's an important visual element in this composition. So what did I choose to do? I said I have two important visual elements in this composition, and I'm going to arrange them in such a way that they balance each other in the composition, right? Some of you probably have gone a little bit farther in analyzing this image and saying, aha, that's the rudimentary rule of thirds you have used there. You chose to put the tree in the bottom left and then the mountain on the top right. We all love the rule of thirds when we first start out in photography, isn't it? Because it's easy to teach, easy to understand, easy to actually employ and use in the field. It's a great starting point. But once you have been shooting for a while, we need to step beyond the rule of thirds. This is very, very rudimentary and works for somebody who's just starting to compose. But beyond that, we need to look at other measures. This is what is called a Baroque diagonal. Conventionally, we have trained ourselves, majority of us, read from left to right, and when we look at an image, we read from bottom to top. So when you arrange visual elements along a diagonal that goes from the bottom left to the top right, it automatically becomes a more pleasing image. Only because that's what we have ingrained within ourselves. That's how we are looking at everything, right? So when you look at something like this, it feels more pleasing. Important to understand that when we are composing in the field. What we exclude from the composition is as important as what we include in the composition to make our story stronger. So instead of analyzing it as a single diagonal, what if you were to subdivide your frame into smaller parts? A very important visual exercise to do while you're in the field. And ask yourself, is every subdivision of my frame contributing to the story? Or is it introducing some distractions that I don't really want, right? And that makes it a more pleasing composition as well, because everything's coming together and is cohesive. And every subdivision of the composition is adding to the story. Okay, so you look at this. This is another example. This is the Nepali coast in Kauai. And you look at it and you go, well, Sapna, you told us about the Baroque diagonal, and I see that happening here. What are the visual elements here that I'm trying to arrange? Obviously, the color is nice and saturated on those mountains. Our eye is going to go there. I like how the light is catching the waves breaking on the beach there. Definitely going to go there. And then, of course, there is luminance to the clouds, which are catching light, right? So these are the visual elements. And it's our job now to arrange them with good weight distribution through the frame. Did I do that? I hope so. Is it possible to always arrange things along a diagonal? No. It's not, because nature is what it is. All I'm saying is being aware that there is a geometric basis to why certain images work and why certain images don't work is extremely important, because when the opportunity arises, you will be able to use it in the field. Okay? So again, think about weight distribution and think about that Baroque diagonal. This is not something that's new to photography. This is actually something that has been employed in art for centuries. You know, Whether you look at The Birth of Venus by Botticelli, or you look at the work of Pablo Picasso, or you look at Salvador Dali, it doesn't matter. All of these artists would actually draw dynamic grids on their blank canvas before they put down their visual elements. We don't have the luxury of that, do we? Because nature is what nature is. This is a dynamic grid. I don't expect us to be holding a dynamic grid and walking around in nature saying, let me see where I can arrange them according to the dynamic grid. We can't do that. But being aware that there is a geometrical basis to making an aesthetic image means your eye will automatically begin to see the geometry in a nature scene. And then, of course, after you capture it, you could always bring it back and do the post-processing. You can always throw a dynamic grid on there and ask yourself, let me see how it'll look if I crop it a little bit differently. Okay, so we talked about geometry and balance, and now we're going to talk about use of space. Suppose I said to you, I like cooking children and wild animals. I like cooking children and wild animals. You look at me and you go, is she a psychopath? What is wrong with her? But if I said, I like cooking, children and wild animals, all of a sudden, the entire meaning of the sentence was changed by a tiny punctuation mark, right? That tiny punctuation mark was so compelling. That's what space is. The smallest of space within your frame will make the biggest meaning to the overall picture. Let's take a look at that. Okay, what is wrong with this image? Well, actually, the question is, what is right with this image and what is wrong with this image are both the same answer. Right? It works in this instance. We have no visual separation between the foreground and the background. The eye of the bird has been merged with the eye of the woman, and it's messing with our depth perception. It becomes an intriguing image in this case because it's funny. It's beautiful placement of visual elements. This doesn't work in nature, though. In nature, it is very important to have what we call the figure-to-ground ratio while composing images. The relationship of the foreground to the background is extremely important. Having adequate visual separation by the proper use of space between your focal points of visual elements is extremely important to generate a meaningful image. Let's take a look at an example here. So this was Ice Beach in Iceland, and you have an oncoming wave, and then you have a stack of ice before that. That tiny sliver of space that you're seeing between the oncoming wave and the foreground ice tells you that there is a separation, that there is depth in the field. What a tiny, tiny sliver of space, right? Now, if that wave had come a little bit farther and I had lost that black line that separates the foreground from the background, it wouldn't have the same kind of impact. Let's take a look at another example. This is especially true of reflections. We have to be very careful. If you're going to place a cactus as your foreground element, then it's important. I see this happening with my workshop clients quite often, where they come across a scene, are very drawn to it, emotionally connect to it, start composing, get so focused on getting the wide angle close to their foreground element that they forget to pay attention to ensure that it's not obscuring the background elements. So here, it was important to achieve not only the separation between the cactus and the rocks and their reflection, but also look at the bank. You want to move around so that there is water all around the reflection and that the edge of the bank doesn't obscure a part of the reflection. So that figure-to-ground ratio, extremely important in composition because it is the use of space, and space is like the punctuation or grammar of the sentence. Okay, moving on to color. What is color? This is Vesterhorn in Iceland. And I like to explain color this way. right? If I'm sitting in the hospital and I'm counseling my patients, I'm going to use a certain tone of voice that tends to be more soothing, expresses empathy. If I'm in the field conducting this workshop and the rainbow is going off of Estrahan, empathy is the last thing you're going to get from me. I'm shouting at the top of my voice saying, I hope you guys are nailing this because this is once in a lifetime moment. I'm shouting out, I hope you have your camera settings right, guys. Let's go. Let's get this, right? That energy, enthusiasm, and absolute joy at witnessing that rainbow form. This was right after a storm, and we thought we would get skunked and not see anything, and then this happens. So how exciting is that? So we modulate the tone of our voice based on the emotional response we want to evoke in the person receiving our words, right? Color does that to an image. Color is the tone with which you speak. Let me elaborate. You all have seen the color wheel. You know that it has warm colors and it has cool colors. Warm colors tend to be the louder tone, the vibrant, energetic, positive, ebullient tone. The cool colors tend to be the soothing tone, sort of quiet, calm, melancholy even, a little bit of sadness, right? So we can use color to convey the mood because we're adjusting the tone with which we speak. Let's look at some specific examples. Okay, here you might argue, Sapna, that looks like pretty warm colors to me. Yes, it does. But at the same time, it looks harmonious to me, kind of calming. How did we achieve that? This is the basis of color theory. We can communicate through color like we would with words, believe it or not. So if you use colors that are closer together, grouped closer together on the color wheel, you generate an image that is more harmonious. A more harmonious image tends to be a more soothing, calming image. You're speaking in that tone. On the other hand, this is another example actually. Let's look at another soothing tone. Again, colors that are closer together produce a soothing tone. So you might say, but Sapna, in nature, colors are what they are. How am I going to change colors? You can, because light changes colors. Because I want to create a soothing image, I will show up in the pre-dawn hours, this is in Wangshan, China, and stand there and know that colors will be softer before the sun comes up. And therefore, I can render an image which is in the same color family, group the colors together, and have a more harmonious image. Because once that sun comes up, the colors are going to get more diverse from each other, and I will not be able to generate a soothing image then, right? So the timing of the light will affect the colors, which will affect the tone with which you speak. Let's take a look at another example. This is in Indonesia, Bali, Indonesia. Here, the sun has come up. What am I going for here? A wow image, the image that tends to get very popular on social media, right? Why is that? Maybe it's not the image you want to hang on your walls, but it is one that people look at for a second and go, wow, because now you're using complementary colors, colors that are at the opposite ends of the color wheel, opposite to each other, tend to produce a more dramatic effect. Now I'm talking in a louder, energetic tone. This concept is important to understand when communicating because each of us speaks with an individual style, has an individual tone. Once you understand how you like to speak, then you can choose the colors accordingly to express yourself. All right, so we talked about balance, use of space, color harmony. I'm going to talk about reduce distractions. When we're speaking, nobody likes to hear a story for 3 hours if it could be told in 30 minutes, right? Or if you're reading and there's a whole bunch of unnecessary sentences and words, doesn't that story lose impact? Exactly the same thing happens when you're generating images. If you include unnecessary distractions in your frame, your image will not be compelling. And how are we going to get rid of distractions? Well, we know. We know the eye is drawn to brightness, right, and color. So if we wanted to decrease the significance of something in our frame, easy. Desaturate it and make it darker. The eye won't go there. Instead, brighten the waterfall. This is again Yosemite, and that's where the eye would go. I'm telling the viewer, hey, I want you to focus on the waterfall, and I'm going to balance the waterfall with the beautiful colors on the granite wall. I don't want you to look at those foreground rocks. They are not important. Don't go there, right? This is another image. We love foggy forests. Why is that? Because a forest is an extremely complex scene, and it becomes very difficult to photograph. But it is highly simplified when fog flows through. That's why we love foggy forests, because it adds a degree of minimalism to the scene that it makes it that much more compelling. Less is more. Be succinct. Don't expand on unnecessary things, right? Here's another example. This is Yosemite, Upper and Lower Yosemite Falls. And here, we have a whole bunch of distractions. I wanted you to look at that tiny waterfall at the bottom, which is the Lower Yosemite Falls, but look at all the long line of cars that we have over there. David, you'll have to tell me when I run out of time. I don't stop talking, so just tell me. Yeah, let me know. Yeah, okay. So that long line of cars that you see is attracting your attention because it's a point of contrast, right? Usually, when we're trying to tell a compelling story, we're doing our best to avoid distractions. We'll probably move away, choose another frame. But here, I loved this scene, and there was just no way those cars were going away. By the time they left, all of the clouds would be gone too, so I just chose to do something that would never make this publishable in National Geographic. You got it. So content-aware fill, right? Like that annoying photographer who steps into your frame just when you're set up and the light's going off. No choice but to content-aware fill. So now, once I have removed those cars, notice how that lower waterfall jumps out at you, and now you even begin to notice the tiny reflection of that small waterfall, right? Now you're looking at things I actually want you to look at. I don't want to tell you the story that Yosemite is crowded. I want to tell you the story that Yosemite is beautiful. Okay, finally, it brings us to the story. We have gained a very vast vocabulary, right? We have learned how to do sentence construction. Now it's time to put everything together and create our photograph. Sorry about the noise, guys. Okay, so how do we do that? How do we bring our story together? The next few minutes, I'm going to talk about extremely important concepts that apply to storytelling. The first and foremost is understanding visual pathway. It does not matter what genre of photographer you are. It does not matter what your subject is that you're shooting. Having a strong visual pathway in your frame is absolutely fundamental to being able to create a compelling image. This image was taken by Aytek Setin, who is the International Landscape Photographer of the Year 2022 and lives in Turkey. He went to Cappadocia and captured this image of cave dwellings that have existed for thousands of years. He waited for the light to hit that tiny doorway, to hit that tiny pathway, because he wants you to be drawn into the image and focus on that tiny cave dwelling and the geometry of the mountains. Or they're not really mountains, they're more like tufa-sized. So anyway, understanding that a visual pathway needs to be created to make an image emotionally compelling is crucial. And how do we do that? We already know. We know what the eye is drawn to: luminance, color, contrast, and geometry. That's it. That's all we have to apply to carve out a visual pathway. Why did, someone like Ansel Adams, he would spend hours burning and dodging, and if you look at Moonrise over Hernandez, it took him 30 years of burning and dodging before he was comfortable enough to release the image. What was he doing there? He was carving out a visual pathway. So every time you look at a photograph of yours and you're about to post it and you think it's done, do that conscious evaluation of how the eye is traveling through the frame. Is it going to the spots that you want it to go? If it's not, then it needs to be fixed. Sometimes it's very easy. You walk into a forest, there's a beautiful leading line, there's fog in the distance. That's a visual pathway that's already laid out for me, right? Super easy. Did I enhance it in post-processing because I want your eye to travel through that scene? Of course I did. So I darkened the foreground, I dodged the fog a little bit, I added a little bit of color to the green along the way to direct your eye, and then added an overall vignette because I want you to stay in the frame. Oftentimes, once you have trained yourself, you'll see the visual pathways in the landscape, but remember, when we bring it back into post-processing, we want to enhance that visual pathway even more. Here is another example. Lots of pictures of Yosemite because it's only 2.5 hours from home and my place of Zen. Again, this is a very popular photograph, tunnel view, iconic location. Probably a bunch of you already have photos of this, right? And I use that fog as a leading line. It goes up to the waterfall, which I did dodge a little bit because I want you to halt and take it in, and then travel back to the mountain where the light is, where the luminance is the greatest, right? So this is how we would work on creating a strong visual pathway. You might say, Sapna, well, in those cases, you had strong leading lines. What if I don't have a leading line? It does not matter, because those concepts that the eye is going to travel to the point of color, luminance, and contrast can be applied in your frame irrespective of whether there is a leading line or not. Here we have foreground element with no leading lines, right? It's quite cluttered actually. But you would still delve into that reflection of the clouds and then travel to the point of maximal luminance, which is the sunset next to halftone. All right, the next concept after the visual pathway that I want to talk about, now we're talking about weaving our stories with interest, right? We like a plot that has twists and turns, has some depth to it. We like characters who are multi-layered and have depth to them, right? And remember, we saw a 3D scene and we condensed it to a 2D flat plate. It is our job now to bring back that 3D feeling through our image. How do we do that? Very simple. Once you grasp this, you'll be doing it all the time. Depth through an image is achieved through transitions. When you look at something that is close to you, you see it as a sharp, focused object. Things that are farther away from you feel blurred, kind of soft. So in your mind, you know that this thing which is sharp is close to you, and that thing which is blurred is far away. So you understand that there is a distance between this and the background. We use the same concept here. So we start to give transitions where we go from dark to light, cool to warm, sharp to soft, desaturated to saturated, and textured to smooth to convey something is in the foreground versus something is in the background. Now look at these examples. In each of these instances, right, we love the wide angle. We like to get really close and make those teeny flowers look gigantic because it invites the viewer into the frame. Once invited, though, we want the viewer to travel through the frame and get that feeling of depth. Notice the transitions applied here? Now that I've told you, you can analyze the image and say, aha, I see the foreground is sharp, it's darker, the background is softer, and it is lighter, and that's what is conveying that sense of depth through the image. Next time you look at an image and you say, I love the depth in this, ask yourself, what transitions have been applied? How is that depth being conveyed? Because you know a story with depth is always much more compelling. And someone might say, but wait, Sapna, what if I'm not using a wide angle, right? What if I'm using a zoom lens and my subject is way far away? How do I convey depth then? It does not matter, guys. Those basic concepts of transition work irrespective of whether you're using, let so sorry about the noise. Whether you're using a zoom lens or whether you're using a wide angle, it really doesn't matter. Again, notice how the foreground is sharper, right? More in focus, background is lighter, softer. Do you see depth through the image? Yes, absolutely. Didn't use a wide angle there. Okay, the next concept I want to introduce at creating compelling story is shading the apple. Look at the apple on the left-hand side. Again, these are all attempts we're making to bring out the 3D feeling in a 2D flat plate. So when we look at the left side, that apple is in harsh light, right? It's in harsh light, and so all the sides are equally lit. Doesn't look quite as enticing as the one on the right-hand side. The apple on the right-hand side is in angled light. There is light and shadow and an interplay there, right? And that makes it feel much more 3D, like you could reach in and touch it. Did I sharpen the dewdrops? You bet I did. Did I accentuate light in certain areas and dodge other areas? Of course, because I want to convey that feeling of depth. This is exactly why nature photographers choose to shoot during periods of angled light, because you get that beautiful interplay of light and shadow, which conveys a 3D feeling. Once you know that concept, when it does happen in nature, you can enhance it even more. Here, only one face of El Cap was lit during sunrise, while the other side was still darker. Did I accentuate that in post-processing? Yes, absolutely. And did I use the wide angle to convey depth by getting really close to something? Yes, I did. And did I darken the foreground? Yes, I did. Did I brighten the background? Yes, I did. Are things in the foreground more sharp? Yes. And things in the background less sharp? Yes. Overall, applying each of those slightly to something that's already existing, always post-process with a gentle hand, and it will bring out the depth in the image that much more. Why do we like backlight so much? I wanted to show this as a specific example. Look at the flower in the bottom left corner. Bottom left. That one was in shade. So what did I do? I dodged it just to bring it out to the same level of luminance as the other flowers, which are actually backlit. I did this to illustrate a point. When something is illuminated with angled light, it has a much more 3D feeling to it because it's incorporating that interplay of light and shadow, which you see happening to the other flowers. You feel like you can reach out and touch those petals, isn't it? I don't quite get the same 3D feeling in the flower on the bottom left because it is not backlit. Important to understand and observe the nuances of light as it travels through the scene, because there will be a decisive moment when it will work right. Even if you're doing just still photography, adjusting the light like you saw in the apple to bring out that 3D relief is key to having an emotionally impactful image. This brings us to the last concept that I want to introduce, and that is of visual tension. So you look at this and go, aha, Sapna, my vocabulary is strong. I know what the visual elements here are, your focal points, the words that you use to create the story. The tree, the foliage is extremely colorful. So my eye is drawn to the red leaves. The bird, the egret, is bright, and so I'm going to look at that. That's easy enough. And you wanted equal weight distribution for your focal points, so you decided to place them with equal weight in the frame. And then you added a nice vignette. I see what you're doing here. The leading lines from the branch go to the bird. The bird looks back at the tree, and so the visual pathway will go from the tree to the bird and the bird to the tree. Established a visual pathway, vignetted the periphery, eye is not traveling out of the frame, done deal. But I want you to understand one concept here. It's not enough to just identify visual elements and arrange them with good weight distribution and visual separation. Just as to have a drama on stage, you need the actors to have a dialogue with each other. They need to be able to talk with each other, right, to create the drama. Same thing in a nature photograph or any photograph. Your focal points must play off of each other. If the branches of the tree were pointing to the left side, our eye would go off the left side of the frame. Think of it. If the bird was looking to the right side, we would look at the tree, branches would lead to the bird, and the bird would lead us off of the frame. So it is important to understand that not only do you arrange them properly, they have to interact with each other in just the right fashion to create that visual pathway that will keep the viewer in the frame. Okay, makes sense? So every time you look at an image, ask yourself, what is the visual pathway here? How is it a compelling story? How is depth conveyed through this? What role is color playing through it? So many things to think about. But the more you do it, the more it becomes second nature. It'll just flow. All of those elements will just, it's like talking. I don't have to think. I speak extempore all the time. I have no set plan of what I'm going to say next, right? It just comes out automatically. Why? Because I have practiced it and practiced it and practiced it to the point that it becomes second nature to me. That's how the picture taking and creation must become. So here again, we use the leading line of the river, go up to the mountain. Obviously, it's a bright spot. You're going to look at it, go up to the moon, look at it, again, bright spot. Then you come down to the reflection, and you repeat that visual pathway. So the takeaways, I had given this as a practice presentation to my workshop clients at the Mystic Redwood Forest last week. And I asked them, what else should I add? And they said, can you please add a takeaway slide? You gave us a ton of information. And I felt the takeaway slide doesn't really have to confine you to what I talked about. I want to talk about three things that are extremely important in the pursuit of this art form. The first is to soak in the miracles. You know, if it wasn't for photography, I don't think I would be standing in freezing water at 2 a.m. in the middle of winter in Iceland and hoping and praying for a miracle, right? You wouldn't do it. It's the pursuit of this art form that places us uniquely in a position to witness miracles. So let's soak them in. Enjoy the process. The process of acquisition of the image is the reward. The actual image is just the icing on the cake. And the next thing I want to say is do not compare. We live in a very, very judgmental world, and every time we compare ourselves to someone else, we might feel a little bit demoralized. Don't do that. The only goal we must set ourselves is my next photograph needs to be better than my last one, because this is my individual journey. Sure, I can share it with others, but I'm not going to say, oh, he's running faster than me or she's running slower than me. No, this is my journey, and in this journey, all I'm going to do is make my next photograph better than my last one. And of course, what I've been saying all along, let's tell compelling stories. Let's make this an interesting journey for us, as well as an interesting journey for everyone who is coming along with us. Wrapping it up, I'm available on all kinds of social media platforms. My website is myname.com, and I do conduct workshops all over the world. You can see the list of places down below. I hope that you get to go out there, enjoy the time, soak in the miracles, grow on your photography journey, become fluent in the visual language, and I hope to see you in the field someday, and I hope to share an adventure with you as well.
Thank you so much. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, that was pretty cool, Sapna Reddy. And there we go. Okay, we're back. Once again for Sapna Reddy. Thank you. Thanks. We're going to take some, want to do some a Q&A real fast? Let's take a couple of questions, Q&A. We're going to be swapping out a speaker that went down. So while we do that Q&A, we'll swap that out. And Emmanuel, we have those microphones? Oh, okay. You get the first one.
Which was the most difficult for you to photograph?
If you could repeat the question, Emmanuel, maybe you repeat it?
Of the photographs that you displayed that you took yourself, which was the most difficult to photograph, be it timing, be it weather, be it the journey to get there?
You know, it's interesting you asked that question. I think it's the emotional component that is the most difficult for me. I lost my father to an allergic reaction to his second dose of COVID vaccine. And that was very difficult to witness. And to heal from that, because I was a physician and there were people dying all around me, the pandemic was really tough. So probably the images that I took during the pandemic were the toughest, not because of subject matter or technical details or anything, but because it was so difficult to dig myself out of that pain and say, focus on art, focus on healing, focus on what's beautiful, and to be able to go back the next day and tell people, you need to get your vaccine, knowing that I lost a father to it, right? It's a dilemma I faced. And if it hadn't been for nature photography, I don't think I could have gotten through it. So that image I showed you of Yosemite Falls, you know, where I said reduce distractions, that was a dedication to the spirit of my father. The forest, the redwood forest, images that I shared with you, I can hear his voice when I go there, you know. So I think because we are expressing ourselves, right? We are sharing parts of our life and parts of the journey that we're going through. The most difficult images are probably the ones that are emotionally very difficult to make. Because gear is easy to learn, right? And once you apply the principles that I talked about, creating images is easy. But achieving a mental state where you can enter that state of flow that we call, you know, the Zen state, where we are truly in an artistic phase and can invest everything we have in just the moment before us and be mindful of it and forget everything else that has happened in the past or is about to happen in the future. To achieve that state is difficult, especially when you have been through some sort of tragedy. So for me, I would say, you can look at my website. There is one image that I created when I went to Utah, and it was in the Badlands, and I thought, oh, I need a break from the pandemic. I'm going to photograph this beautiful foliage. But I got there, and I made the picture of a dead tree, which had zero foliage. And it was just the most compelling image for me, because it showed me that when the proper light hits even a dead tree, it becomes the most beautiful thing in nature. Because of its sculpture, because of its grace, because there is beauty in suffering. And that is a part of life we must embrace and move on. So that's the image that won the Outdoor Photographer Nature Colors contest recently. And it's one that has been highly celebrated on social media because my emotions were conveyed through that image. It was not an easy image to create for the emotional component, but once it came out, what I was feeling, others felt too, so it was very gratifying.